Hey everybody, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, and today on the podcast I have a returning guest with me. I have Peter Morley. Hello, Peter.
Hello, Kelly. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so thrilled to talk to you again. Some of you, if you've been listening for a while, may remember an episode that we did with Peter and Red, and that episode was about a trip that Peter and Red had taken together to DC. And Peter has gone back to DC, not for the first time you've been back, I think.
No, I think the second time since we've spoken.
So wanted to catch up with Peter and hear about his most recent trip and some of the stuff that's going on with healthcare. If you are not familiar with who Peter is, or if you haven't listened to the previous episode, Peter is a patient advocate, and he's been going to these trips to DC lots of times to meet with our congresspeople and to ask them how they're going to vote and to try to encourage them to vote in ways that will improve the lives of people who need health care. Did I represent you accurately there, Peter?
Yeah, I'm listening to you, and, I think plead with them would be the correct term. But yes, you represented me very well. Thank you very much. You saved me a ton of explaining.
Peter, do you even know at this point how many trips you've made to DC like this?
This was my 8th trip, and it was definitely my most ambitious trip. And I didn't set out for it to be that way, and I think I always end up saying that. But I guess when you reach out to these offices and, you make appointments, or some appointments come in right away, and then some take a little longer depending on the scheduling person. And it gets very tempting, and you try to figure out, it's like a puzzle, how is it going to work? I could move this here and that there. And fortunately, logistically, it works out most of the time. Not all the time, but it worked out very well this time, and I was able, over the course of 2 days, meet with 26 offices. There were 8 House representatives, including the Speaker, and 18 Senate offices. That makes 26.
That's incredible. And so that was in 2 days. Let's talk just logistics for a minute, because that's a lot of meetings. So first of all, when you call to make these appointments, is this all over the phone? Do you do some of this scheduling over email?
At this point, it's all through email, but when you start out, basically, there are 2 ways you could do it. Depending on the Senate office or the congressional office, some of them have on their .gov page, whether they're the representative or the senator, there's a appointment or schedule a meeting with the senator or the representative that you can do a request through their .gov website. Or if they don't have that, you call their office, and they usually supply you with an email address for the scheduler. But at this point, I pretty much know all the schedulers. I have all their email addresses, so it's a shortcut for me. But if you're starting out in advocacy, that would be the way to do it. And it could be very time-consuming as well.
And so when you're making all these schedules then, especially if you're trying to fit in so many meetings in just 2 days, what do you just practically do? Do you have like an Excel spreadsheet or a calendar? How do you keep track of all of these and make sure you're not scheduling 3 things for the same time?
Actually, I use my Google Calendar. That's my own spreadsheet. I mean, I kind of just put the times in, and at this point, once I set certain meetings, I give them the option, like I have such and such a time to, I could see you here or there. I know I sound like a really important person that, you have to make time for me, but a lot of them are flexible. A lot of them want to make that time to meet with you. A lot of them appreciate the time of you coming to see them. And then there are the offices that aren't as receptive, and they don't want to meet you without somebody from their constituency. Technically, they are allowed to, make their constituents a priority and say that. But most of the offices have been very welcoming because I am a patient advocate. I am a patient, but I do represent a lot of voices from around the country. And those voices I bring with me, even though it's, on paper, it's still representing these people. And, most of the offices understand it. Sometimes I feel, the ones that don't want to see me, they're kind of using that as an excuse. and it is what it is.
These kind of trips must just be completely exhausting. I mean, I'm thinking about for myself, if I tried to do that many meetings in one day, and I don't have any physical disabilities, I don't have any health problems, but to me that would be extremely exhausting. And you do have some health problems, so how do you even manage to get through these days? Do you build in breaks for yourself?
I try to, and then I usually fail. But honestly, I do. I give myself, 45 minutes for lunch, obviously at the beginning of the day, and time for breakfast, dinner at the end of the day. But, I think in between breakfast and lunch and dinner, I usually don't have any downtime. And the other thing is I have to be constantly cognizant of the time without being rude during the meeting, looking at my mobile phone. Fortunately, most of these offices, they have clocks, so I could look at them a quarter of my eye and know, I have to, leave here, 5 minutes at least to get to the next meeting, depending on where it is. And if I'm traveling from the Senate to the congressional or the House side, I need to allot myself a lot more time. And I spent Monday, I went there on Monday and Tuesday to D.C., and I spent Monday, I started on the Senate side on the third floor in the Hart Building in my first two meetings. Then I went to the House and spent it over there, went to the Capitol Building, and then I ended up back in the Senate. And it didn't even dawn on me that I started and ended in the same building, which is the Hart Senate Building, on the same floor, on the third floor. So I didn't even realize. It was like I made a full circle. For 9 o'clock in the morning to 6:15 at night, I was back in the same place I started from. And that was completely unintentional.
All right. So I love logistics and could probably keep talking about this stuff all night. But let's talk about some of the actual meetings that you had. When you meet with these offices, who are you meeting with?
It depends. Some of these offices at this point, being my 8th trip down there, I've cultivated relationships with most of them. And since I go down there to advocate for healthcare, in the Senate, I like to try to meet with the members of the Health Committee, which is the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and they make the decisions in the Senate for healthcare. So I like to meet with various members. I still haven't met with all of them at this point, but I'm trying to finish meeting with all of them. And then in Congress, there are two different sub-health committees, one of the Ways and Means Committee that make decisions for Medicare and Social Security, and then there's the sub-health committee of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and they make decisions on Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. I tried to purposely meet with those members, but on this trip, people had asked me to meet with their specific Congress people. So I met with those members, and I did meet with Speaker Ryan as well. So normally that's how I go about, planning my trips. But I also, if there's anything going on specifically in a state, like on this trip, one of my concerns, probably the biggest reason that I went down there, was for Medicaid work requirements. Health and Human Services had made an executive decision, which they can do, to enforce or to allow states that request them to allow Medicaid work requirements. This would affect a lot of people who are caregivers, and they have to be there with their child who happens to be disabled, or a member of their family that's disabled, and they need to be there, and they're dependent on Medicaid. So they're dependent on Medicaid, and I was advocating for them because there were 10 states that put in these requests to enforce Medicaid work requirements within their state. And those are the states that I wanted to meet with because the decisions were made more at the state level, the requests, but I wanted to see what the senators' perspective was. So, for instance, Wisconsin was one of those states that requested Medicaid work requirements. So I booked a meeting with Senator Ron Johnson's office, and during the whole tax bill, he wouldn't take a meeting with me, but all of a sudden now he was going to take a meeting with me, or his legislative assistant was. And that's kind of, as a patient advocate, those are the kinds of things that, you keep in mind when you make these trips. And even though I wasn't meeting with anybody in the sub-health committee in the House, I still had concerns there too, because there's a bill to reform the American Disabilities Act. So I was advocating for the ADA Education Reform Act of 2017. So every congressional office, all 7 of them, and even in Speaker Ryan's office, I pleaded with them to vote no on this as a disabled person, putting the onus on the patient instead of a business to take the onus of responsibility. To me, as a disabled person, it's disturbing, it's horrifying, and I have to say the Republican offices that I had met with in the House, they all told me that their congressperson was noncommittal. And when they went to vote, they all voted yes. And I can't believe that they hadn't made up their minds at that point. So the 2 Democratic offices that I had met with both voted no, so I'm very happy to say that. But I think they had told me during the meeting that they were going to vote no. So.
This is HR 620. It's the ADA Education and Reform Act of 2017. And so it's passed in the House now.
It has.
And so now it needs to go to the Senate.
Yes.
Is that something that you talked at all to the Senate offices about?
Oh, absolutely. I talked to every Senate office about it, whether they would support it or not. And all the Democratic offices that I spoke with support it. And there was, sort of the same kind of like non-committal attitude towards the act from the Republican offices that I'd met with. And I had met with several of them. I had met with Senator Collins's office, Senator Cassidy's office, and Senator Alexander's office, Senator Enzi's office. So they're all, Republican offices on except for Senator Johnson, on the Health Committee. So they were kind of noncommittal. Seems like Susan Collins was leaning towards voting no, from what I can glean. But it was something that I did advocate strongly against. And again, speaking for my own disability and for speaking for 60 million people, which is a big burden in itself, it's a big weight on your shoulders, representing these people and getting these sometimes getting 15 minutes with these people and sometimes even less to make your case. You have to really speak from your heart, and you gotta really put yourself out there. I always find it best, I think I mentioned this last time when we spoke, is that in a non-confrontational way, in a very conversational way, because I don't go in there expecting to change anyone's minds, but I do go in there and expect that we can speak civilly to each other and we can have these conversations and I can hear their perspectives and then I can tell them why they're wrong. No, I'm just kidding. But I can tell them what their constituents think, because that's who I'm representing, and those are the stories that I bring with me. And sometimes I do have to be more objective and bite my tongue until it bleeds. It's important to keep these conversations going. It's important to hear the perspectives of people that you don't agree with, because there's not a lot of that going on in Washington at this moment. There's a lot of offices, and I did hear that a lot, especially on the Senate side, where the Democratic offices aren't speaking to the Republican offices. And even though they're not so far away from each other, and we're going back to logistics again, but they're not too far away from each other in proximity. We're talking 10, 15, 20 feet away from each other. They have no idea what's going on in each other's offices. I know more than they do. And I'm the conduit between these two offices and playing messenger, operator, whatever,
Yeah, that's pretty horrifying.
Yeah, no, it is.
I don't want to forget to remind people that they should be calling their senators to tell them to vote no on this